In 1950, amid the bustling streets of Tokyo that had begun to rise from the wounds of war, a foreign man named James Wright walked toward a traditional dojo. James was a wing commander of the Royal Air Force. He came with a clear purpose: to find a man who had once been both his enemy and the shadow haunting his life, General Ito. However, upon arriving there, James did not find the general. Instead, he was greeted by Ito's son, a young man named Oda. James's presence instantly changed the calm atmosphere of the dojo into one filled with tension. From the very beginning, Oda eyed him with suspicion, trying to figure out who this stranger was and why he had come looking for his father. Oda then ordered his students to attack James. Seeing all his students defeated so easily, Oda quickly commanded them to stop. At that very moment, the scene shifted to events of the past. Several years earlier, in 1942, at the height of World War II, the Philippines was under Japanese occupation. The Japanese exploited the nation's natural resources while strengthening their defenses. On the other side, the Allied forces, consisting of the United States and Britain, were desperately trying to reclaim the Philippines. The Great Battle of Bataan became one of the most decisive points. From here began the story of the suffering of prisoners of war. We are then shown James Wright in his younger years. At that time, he led a British air squadron. But his plane was shot down over the skies of the Philippines. James survived with injuries, though his co-pilot was killed instantly. The next morning, James tried to hide in the jungle, moving stealthily to avoid Japanese patrols. He even managed to kill several soldiers with a knife and explosive traps. However, his lone resistance did not last long. The Japanese forces surrounded him from all sides, forcing James to surrender and eventually be captured. James was then taken to a Japanese prisoner-of-war camp. There, he saw many American and British soldiers also held captive. The camp was commanded by a ruthless figure, General Ito, a high-ranking Japanese officer known for his cruelty and rigid military discipline. One of his most loyal subordinates was Captain Endo, a field commander who often carried out orders with an iron fist. At first, James was nearly executed in the jungle on Ito's orders. Yet with his martial skills, he managed to fight back and kill 3 Japanese executioners sent to finish him off. Unfortunately, his escape attempt failed. He was once again trapped by Japanese troops and dragged back to the camp. In front of General Ito, James was interrogated. From James's pocket, Ito found a necklace and a Royal Air Force badge. Having recently lost his favorite soldier, Corporal Hirano, who had been killed by British forces, Ito grew even more furious. But instead of executing James outright, Ito decided to keep him alive. The reason was simple: Ito wanted to personally test the combat skills of this British soldier by pitting him against Japan's best fighters. That night, James was placed in the prisoners' barracks with the others. It was here that we were introduced to several important figures. First was Randall, an American soldier nicknamed the Bearded One for his scruffy appearance. Second was Gabriel, a young but firm first sergeant from the United States Army. And most importantly, Captain Collins, a senior American officer who was the most respected figure among the captives. From them, James learned about the prisoners' condition. Every day they were forced into hard labor, including building the camp's perimeter walls. Collins also explained that it was nearly impossible for anyone to escape the camp alive. The next morning, in line with General Ito's promise, James was forced into the duel arena. He was matched against Japan's best fighter, a brutal soldier nicknamed Johnny. Before facing James, Johnny had already slaughtered 3 other captives without mercy. Then it was James's turn. The fight was fierce, but James managed to endure thanks to his unique background. Before the war, he had studied various martial arts techniques in Hong Kong, Thailand, and even Japan itself. This made his fighting style superior. When he hesitated to finish his opponent, Ito shouted, ordering him to fight to the death. This victory shocked many. Collins began to see great potential in James, while Endo demanded that Ito execute him immediately. But for some reason, Ito refused. He remained curious about the forbidden techniques James had used. Several days later, James was introduced to Teresa, a Filipino civilian woman forced to serve as a medic for the Japanese. Taken from her family, she had been working at the camp for 3 months. She was the one who treated James after his brutal fight with Johnny. Teresa was both amazed and bewildered, for normally no prisoner ever received the privilege of being cared for in the Japanese medical tent. From conversations with Ito, it became clear that the general was increasingly fascinated by James's abilities, especially since his fighting resembled techniques considered forbidden in Japanese martial arts. Ito was convinced James must have once studied such methods from a Japanese master in the past. Day after day, James was forced to keep fighting. At one point, he even battled 3 soldiers at once. Interestingly, James refused to kill them despite having the chance. To him, they were merely ordinary soldiers following orders, just like himself. But his mercy brought tragedy. The 3 were executed for disgracing the honor of the Japanese military. Amid all this suffering, James began to plan an escape. He suggested to Collins and Gabriel that all they needed was a radio to contact the Allied forces offshore. Their target was the radio in the guard tower. One night, taking advantage of a distraction created by other prisoners, James managed to sneak into the tower and steal the device. Just as he was about to be caught, Teresa discovered him. Luckily, she chose to cooperate, on the condition that she be included in any escape attempt. The radio was successfully hidden among rice sacks, and from then on James became more determined to lead this dangerous breakout. The next day, General Ito ordered a brutal punishment for James. He was tied in the center of the arena, and one by one, Ito's men were summoned to beat him with wooden sticks each time the bell rang. All the prisoners watched in horror. James's body was battered repeatedly, yet despite being bloodied, he stood firm. Ito's face grew increasingly perplexed. How could this British soldier still endure? At last, when the opportunity arose, James turned the tables and fought back against his tormentors. defeating 3 of them in front of Ito's eyes. This infuriated Ito. In his rage, he vented his fury by shooting several innocent prisoners. After that duel, James was once again treated in the medical tent by Teresa. The woman was confused, as no prisoner had ever been granted such special care. She then told her story, how she had been torn from her family by Ito and forced to serve as a medic for months. James began to feel sympathy, and the two built mutual trust. James then asked Ito why he was treated so differently, tortured but never executed. Ito replied that he was intrigued, because James used forbidden combat techniques known only in certain Japanese martial arts schools. That was why he wanted to keep testing James's limits. James coldly responded, if Ito kept forcing him to fight, eventually he would run out of soldiers. A few nights later, James and Gabriel slipped out of the camp. They headed to the coastline to confirm something. Sure enough, James discovered the wreck of a glider plane hidden in the brush. He explained that such a glider could be towed by a rescue plane, giving them a chance to escape. James also picked up radio signals in the Navajo language, the coded speech of Native American troops used by the U.S. military. This proved that Allied forces were not far away. Gabriel began to believe him, though the plan remained extremely risky. The next morning, tensions in the camp escalated. A Japanese soldier was found dead, and General Ito immediately gathered all the prisoners. He accused them of betrayal. Captain Collins was made the prime suspect and brutally tortured for a confession. Seeing his comrade near death, James finally confessed that he was the infiltrator the night before. Arrogantly, Ito demanded James demonstrate the forbidden technique he possessed, or the prisoners would be executed. James refused, and as a result, several captives were shot on the spot. As an additional punishment, Collins was forced to fight 3 Japanese soldiers at once. That night, James and Gabriel once again crept to the hill near the shore. Using the radio, they sent their coordinates in code.
That's a Plan 4.
The attempt worked. The next morning, American forces launched a massive bombardment on the Japanese camp. Explosion after explosion destroyed the guard posts, throwing the Japanese into chaos. Amid the confusion, Teresa rushed to the prisoners to help them escape. James urged her to come with them. A fierce battle erupted inside the camp.
Tulungan niyo kami!
Gabriel fought ferociously against Captain Endo. The duel was brutal, but Gabriel eventually defeated the ruthless commander. Meanwhile, Collins, still driven by personal vengeance, continued to fight, exacting retribution against the Japanese troops. At the same time, James entered General Ito's tent. The long-awaited confrontation finally occurred. Ito challenged James to a one-on-one duel with katanas, the traditional Japanese sword. The fight was intense, filled with emotion and pride. James managed to bring Ito down, but before finishing him, Gabriel arrived and pulled James away. Seeing that James deliberately spared his life, the wounded Ito let them go, as if offering his final gesture of respect. By lighting a flare, James and his comrades signaled the rescue plane. The glider they had discovered earlier was prepared, then towed by the American aircraft, lifting them away from that hellish camp. The prisoners were finally saved.
Alright lads, we'll be back.
Several years after the war ended, in Tokyo in 1950, James Wright, now more mature, returned to a life that had once been part of his darkest past. With calm steps, he entered a traditional Japanese dojo filled with the sounds of students practicing martial arts. The dojo was led by a young man named Oda Ito, son of General Ito. James's presence instantly drew attention. Oda stopped his training, then looked at the foreigner with deep caution. A great question stirred in his mind: who was this man, and what was the purpose of his arrival? Yet as he observed James's upright bearing and steady gaze, Oda recalled the old stories told by his father. General Ito had often spoken of a Western prisoner unlike the others, a British soldier he regarded as the strongest fighter he had ever met. His father had even once said that if that man ever returned, he would be someone worthy of respect. Oda's certainty grew stronger when James demonstrated a martial art technique that had once been his father's obsession. The movement flowed flawlessly, full of power, and reflected years of discipline. At once, Oda realized that the man before him was the very figure his father had spoken of. With deep respect, Oda then retrieved a treasured item he had kept all this time, the Royal Air Force badge that once belonged to James, which had been seized by General Ito during the war. He returned it to James, saying that his father had died 3 months earlier, but before his passing, he often spoke of an undefeated foreign fighter. Now Oda knew for certain that man was James Wright. James received the badge with emotions of both sorrow and relief. There was a mutual respect between them, needing no lengthy words. After a brief bow, James stepped out of the dojo with firm strides. The camera followed his long shadow across the wooden floor, marking the end of his long journey. From a prisoner of war who had to survive unimaginable suffering, to now being honored even by the son of his greatest enemy, James's story truly found a meaningful conclusion. The end. From the story of James Wright, we learn that true courage is not only about fighting and surviving, but also about preserving honor, showing compassion, and respecting even those who were once enemies. If you enjoyed this video, don't be shy, hit the like button, and if you disliked it, hit the dislike button twice just to be sure. You should watch the full movie. Thank you very much for watching.